A volatile relationship ends with an act of desperation.
The first words ever were him.
But the evidence isn't adding up.
She was saying that she was in fear for her life.
You're gonna threaten to arrest me for defending myself.
But he was not a fighter.
And when a suspect's social media reveals a disturbing past, investigators must determine if it's just entertainment or a window into the mind of a calculated killer.
She had a very prolific profile.
Some of them were just regular TikTok videos, and some were kind of disturbing.
I truly believe that she's evil.
And racetrack. But on August 10th, 2022, the fun and games are disrupted by an emergency call.
Polk County 911, why was your emergency?
My boyfriend just tried attacking me, and I had no choice but to defend myself.
Okay, what's your name?
Marique Ruth. He is laying on the floor, and I'm pretty sure he's dead.
Okay, why do you think he's dead?
Because I shot him.
The person shot was John Killen, who was living in the home with her and her adult son.
She told the dispatcher that she wasn't going to go near him, and then that's when she was instructed to exit the house for the arriving officers.
When police get there, they find Marique and her 22-year-old son Cole waiting as instructed. Officers quickly enter the residence to check on the boyfriend.
John was face down in the living room. He appeared to be shot multiple times.
You could see a large amount of blood coming from what appeared to be his mouth behind his ear. So there were some visible wounds.
Right away, I could see a bullet hole in the side of his neck.
They tried to render aid and found that he was already deceased. He was declared dead at the scene.
Marique seemed shocked with the whole situation.
Me like he was gonna punch me. I grabbed my gun out of my purse.
Okay, then what happened?
I just pulled the trigger.
His bedroom from the living room where John and Marique were arguing when he said that 3 or 4 shots occurred from behind him. He says he didn't see it.
The overall factor was that Marique had been on and off again with John. They argued a lot.
Marique said that she was scared of John, that he might physically assault her, and that's why she had to use her gun in self-defense.
Peer into the past of both Marique and John.
John Killen was born in Des Moines, Iowa in 1981. He was the youngest of 3 boys raised by LaDonna and David Killen.
LaDonna took care of the home and kids, and John's father was a truck driver his whole life.
John didn't really have a childhood. John's dad was hard on John.
John adored his mother, but by the time he was in...
And the visit turned out to, I'm never coming back home. John was 16 and he still needed a lot of guidance.
In her absence, John tried to build a relationship with his father.
John didn't graduate high school. He'd rather go to work with his dad, working on semi-trucks. He wanted that, approval from his father. He wanted that so badly.
In his teen years, John began dating his childhood friend, Angela.
John and I met in middle school, so junior high school. We just hung out basically every day, so we just were just like, I guess we're just boyfriend and girlfriend now.
John decided the relationship was important enough to settle down, and in 2002, he and Angela got married. 3 years later, their son was born.
My mom kind of spoiled me a little bit.
I was my dad's right-hand man a lot of the time, and it was very just like, he's just learning.
He was just always trying to be a better father than what he had as a child.
But despite John's efforts, he couldn't escape the patterns he learned at an early age.
When my parents got divorced, I was probably 5 or 6 years old.
The last straw for John and I's relationship was when we had a verbal argument in our home, and I see Joe, his head is buried in the couch with his hands over his ears because we were fighting, and I couldn't handle that.
Mentally, the divorce changed him. It made John, I feel, a lot more depressed, and he would drink more. John was scared to be alone. It was the abandonment from his father and his mother. Shortly after John's divorce was final, he had gotten on a dating site and met Cassie.
I would say with John and I's relationship, it was pretty fast. When we initially started dating, I knew that he drank some. I just didn't know how much. We got engaged shortly after we got together, probably about a year.
When John learned he was going to be a father again, he approached it as a second chance.
I always encouraged him to go to therapy. He was put on meds and things were going well. But when he wanted to drink, obviously the meds and beer would not get along. The whole time that John and I were together was kind of off and on as far as arguing, good times, great memories, bad moments.
John's struggles with alcohol continued, and by 2022, he and Cassie separated.
He had to have somebody there at all times just to feel like wanted. It wasn't even a month after we had split, he found Marique.
She was completely different than my uncle's previous relationships. She was cool, collected, kind of laid back, easy to interact with.
He was excited about it. He said that, she worked, had a good paying job. She had her own apartment, a son that lived with her that was around Joe's age.
I thought she was a chill person to be around. My dad seemed happy. Stuff was going well.
But 5 months after moving in with Marique, John's last chance at a happy family has ended in violence. And detectives are beginning their investigation into what happened.
I told the officers, hey, why don't you take Marique and Cole up to PD, and we'll be up there as soon as we can to interview them. After that, I did go inside the house, look at the crime scene real quick.
John's body is positioned on the floor beside a couch which divides the living room from the kitchen.
At the time, his legs was towards the couch. I noticed that there's shell casings on the floor and some were on the cushions of the couch.
We noticed right away that there was one shell casing in the kitchen area, and the other shell casings were on the other side of the couch in the living room area. So someone would have to advance over the top of the couch in order to fire those rounds.
Detectives must ask, why would someone claiming self-defense advance on their attacker?
How did the shell casing get to the opposite side of where the body's lying? That's kind of strange to me. She's claiming self-defense. Things are just not matching up right now. We need to lock this place down and get a search warrant.
Coming up, Marique tells investigators about John's history of violence.
She said John had been involved in another domestic incident with a prior girlfriend.
But his loved ones tell a different story.
I was never worried about my dad hurting someone. My dad never got physical.
Altoona police are in the early stages of investigating the death of John Killen. His girlfriend, Marique Ruth, claims she shot him in self-defense.
After looking at the crime scene, to me, it didn't quite convince me that it's self-defense yet, just due to the shell casings. There's more to the story that we don't know about.
While awaiting a search warrant, investigators gather a formal statement from Marique.
She seemed shaken, certainly initially, but she calmed down and she was very cooperative.
Marique said that her and John's relationship was relatively new. She said that they were always constantly arguing, that he was always drunk and always high.
Marique tells detectives John had never been physically abusive with her before, but he did have a history of violence.
She had informed me that John had been involved in another domestic incident with a prior girlfriend.
According to Marique, John had choked his ex-girlfriend Cassie, who got a court to issue a no-contact order. Marique says she had that in the back of her mind when she and John got into an argument earlier that evening.
Leading up to that day, there was an argument over money. Marique was upset by John's not holding up his agreement within their relationship to get a job and to stop drinking. Marique said they were arguing over a span of hours. John left for a short period of time to take his young daughter back to the mother's house.
Marique assumed John would use the time to cool off, but when he returned, the situation escalated.
She believed that he was drunk and high on cocaine.
Marique tells investigators that she went into the bedroom to avoid John, then realized she'd left her son in danger.
Marique told me that she could overhear essentially what she describes as this yelling match or a brawl of some type. So Marique told me that she grabbed her handgun out of the side portion of her bed, and then she took that handgun out to the living room area where John and Cole were seated, essentially in order to intimidate John.
She said Cole was tired of the arguing, so he left on his own to go downstairs.
She told John he needed to leave, and he said something to the effect of, "Bitch, I'm not leaving. You need to leave."
John had stood up and was going to come at her over the top of the couch. She told me that John swung at her. Because of that action, she fired a warning shot at him. Marique's claim was she was fearful that John was going to continue to come at her, so she fired 3 more times at John.
Marique says as soon as she realized what she'd done, she dropped the weapon and called 911. When investigators speak to Marique's son, his statement is consistent with hers.
Marique was saying that she was in fear for her life and that she was retreating. Well, that's fine, except that the shell casings are telling us another story. The only way that those shell casings can get on the other side of the couch is if Marique, instead of retreating in some fashion, she actually advanced on John.
After receiving the search warrant, detectives analyze the scene more closely to confirm Marique's story. Though aspects of the scene are consistent with her version of events, other details stand out.
There was a handgun on the kitchen table, which we expected to see.
Marique said she fired down towards the floor or towards the couch, but the shell casings are not on the right-hand side. they're on the left-hand side of her person on the couch. That doesn't make sense. She had to be switched around, and she was in the living room, and John was in the kitchen.
Despite investigators' concerns, the attorney's office decides they do not have enough to pursue the case. But shortly after the interviews, John's loved ones call police, angry about the decision.
I talked to Joe Killen, which is John's son. Joe said, "What the heck's going on? John's not an aggressive person. This is not making sense."
My dad never got physical. I was never worried about my dad hurting someone, especially my mom and Cassie, during an argument. But I guess Marique found my dad texting Cassie, saying that he misses her. And I think Marique felt betrayed.
Police hope Cassie can corroborate or deny Joe's claims, so they contact her for an interview.
I felt that John and Marique's relationship was pretty toxic. But the way that I saw it when I was sitting there answering questions is, if I could get up and walk out the door, why couldn't she?
After learning jealousy might have been the cause of John Killen's death, police reach out to his ex-girlfriend, Cassie Swanberg. She says his recent text messages sounded like a desperate attempt to escape his crumbling relationship with Marique Ruth.
I did not have any intent of getting back with John. I am sure that Marique saw it a different way. All he kept saying to me was that she's crazy.
When investigators ask Cassie about Marique's claim that John choked her, she says it was a misunderstanding.
There was moments where we would get physical, but I never felt like he was going to hurt me. I never felt like my life was threatened.
She mentioned basically he'd put his arms around her neck or on her neck, but didn't strangle her. And it was a recount of something that happened many years prior.
When I ended things, I was encouraged by the police department to file a no-contact order. That was the last thing that I wanted to do, but I needed my space.
They also interview John's ex-wife, Angela, who corroborates Cassie's depiction of John.
He gets temperamental. He had some jealousy issues, but it was all verbal arguing. It wasn't anything else. He would never get physical with me. He was not a fighter.
So what Marique is saying doesn't quite match up.
Detectives return to the precinct to review the inconsistencies. While they're talking, an officer from another department overhears their discussion.
It led me to remember an incident that took place approximately 2 months before that, in which Marique had made statements to me about shooting John.
That was a bombshell. We had no idea, and so immediately we bring up the body cam footage.
On June 4th of 2022 at approximately 8:11 p.m., I was called to assist Officer Dokes at the Casey's general store in the parking lot. Marique had called 911, essentially claiming a domestic situation and wanting John removed from the house. She stated that John was highly intoxicated.
At the time, Marique said she and John had been arguing, but there was no assault or physical altercation.
She had asked John to leave. The problem with that was, from a legal standpoint, is that he's on the lease. Despite the issues with alcoholism, it's not illegal to be drunk in your house.
As I was standing there with Marique, John's niece, Haley Killen, arrived on scene.
Would you like me to go talk to John? I'll go talk to John. You go talk to John and he's gonna f***ing end up hitting you.
She was talking about how he would just show up and cause a scene, pretty much. And I had told her that if he does that, to just call the cops. And she had kept making excuses as to why it wouldn't matter.
Okay, if you busted in, call the cops again and make sure that they didn't something busted in. I thought
I kind of lost it on her at that point.
You know, it's not very smart to be talking about.
So he can.
No,
he can
no,
say
no.
that-
But when you're sitting here making premeditated statements, it's not smart. And that's exactly what that is. So you know what happens in the event that that happens? This audio recording, video recording of this is going to play against you. And it's not going to go in your favor.
You're going to threaten to arrest me for defending myself.
The footage, taken just 2 months before John's death, casts serious doubt on Marica's claims of self-defense.
It always makes your spidey senses tingle a little bit, because if somebody's talking about that ahead of time, they've got a preconceived notion of, as long as they just say that they're in fear for their lives, they can get away with murder.
Rather than confront Marica and tip her off to their concerns, detectives pay a visit to John's niece, Haley Killen.
On the afternoon of August 11th, Officer Friedrich from the Altoona Police Department showed up to my house.
What came out of that interview was that John was very mouthy, that he drinks. However, he has never been physical with Marica.
Marica had never, to me, stated that she was scared of John or that she was in fear of her life.
Haley admits her uncle was flawed, but says if anyone in the relationship was violent, it was Marica.
She had always let it be known that she did have a permit to carry and that it was there to protect her if need be. When Marica made those comments, me and my uncle kind of brushed it off as like it was a joke. We didn't really take it seriously.
She claims Marica had even made thinly veiled threats against Cassie.
April of 22, Marica was on the phone company trying to put John's number on her phone account to take off from Cassie's. They were kind of arguing back and forth, and she made comments about how she can commit murder and make it look like a suicide.
Coming up, Marica's online videos reveal a shocking new piece of evidence.
In this video, let's start off with a headstone.
And detectives pit mother against son to see who will come clean.
When we talked to Cole, that changed everything.
Allegations of Marica Ruth's threats against John Killen and his ex-girlfriend prompt detectives to take a closer look at her life through social media.
Haley was the one that brought the TikToks to life. She gave me Marica's TikTok name on her account.
Some of them were just regular TikTok videos, and some were kind of disturbing.
There was one that had a picture of a kind of a snarling wolf saying, "Don't push me or I'll do things that you never thought I would do."
One video in particular catches investigators' eyes.
In this video, it looked like she might have been proposed to or engaged, because she does have a ring on her finger, but it started off with a headstone.
We learned that she was married to somebody much younger than her.
There was a shooting in that incident too. And she claimed that this husband committed suicide.
She openly talked about it. My husband shot himself in front of me.
But this had never been brought up by Marique through hours of interviews. And so to me, that seemed like something somebody would bring up.
For us as investigators, it changed the dynamic of how we would approach this case, because now we have another significant other that's dead. And so we had to investigate the circumstances surrounding her former spouse's death.
Through a records request, police discover that Marica's former husband, Dustin Ruth, died 2 years earlier on October 4th, 2020, in Chickasaw County, Iowa.
We went to Chickasaw County, we got the report, we got the photos, and we really dug into it.
Dustin James Ruth was his full name at birth. He was born August 23rd of 1997. Even from a very tiny age, you could tell that his heart was full of love for anybody and everybody. But there was some abuse as a child.
Emotional scars from abuse affected all aspects of Dustin's life.
He had depression very bad. He was bipolar. He liked to have somebody there with him. It's like he was almost afraid to be alone by himself.
When Dustin was 19, he met 37-year-old Marique Ruth through mutual friends.
They had phone conversations. I was pretty shocked and surprised, especially after I learned about the big age difference between the two of them.
2 years later, in December 2018, they got married and moved in together along with Marica's son. Not long after their marriage, Dustin's family noticed signs of trouble.
When I would get a call from him, she was always on the phone. She thrived on that control that she had over Dustin. He told me she accused him of cheating on her all the time. It was always a threat of, I'll beat your ass.
Just before the couple's second anniversary, Dustin's mother got the terrible news from Marica's son.
It was Sunday, October 4th of 2020. My husband and I were in church, and I had over 30 missed calls. I called Cole back, and he answered, and I said, Cole, what's wrong? And he said, Dustin is dead.
Marique claimed Dustin shot himself during an argument in their bedroom.
She said that Dustin grabbed her handgun. He just turned around and looked at her and shot himself.
The investigation did not yield enough evidence to prove otherwise, and Marique was never charged in relation to Dustin's death.
Our local sheriff's department declared that Dustin had committed suicide. Marique moved to Urbandale, Iowa, the first weekend in December of the same year with another man. I have my suspicions, but I can't prove them.
To detectives investigating John Killen's death, the similarities are uncanny.
John and her former spouse were younger than her, and they both died by gunshot wounds, and Marique was essentially present for both of those deaths. It really made us bear down as to the facts and circumstances, especially for John Killen's case, of exactly what Marique was telling us.
Uncovering another dead husband, has strengthened police suspicions that Marique Ruth murdered John Killen.
John Killen's autopsy showed that he was shot 4 times.
2 of the bullets went into his wrist, down his arm, and out his bicep or tricep area. There's another shot that went into his belly, and another one that went into his neck.
Marique is describing how John came after her and how she fired a warning shot, which didn't work, and then 3 shots to his chest to defend herself. So this couldn't be self-defense when she shot him 4 times.
It appeared that every time she shot, it did hit John.
I found that the round that broke his wrist to be significant in the circumstances that he's probably got his hands up trying to protect himself from being shot.
Though it's possible that the wound was caused while John was trying to punch Marique, the bullet positioning makes her claims seem unlikely.
He was basically trying to defend himself after she shot him the first time. "What are you doing? I can't believe you shot me," and was backing away from her as she continued to shoot.
The other really significant thing that I saw on the autopsy report was the toxicology. Marique was saying that John was really, really drunk and belligerent and was going to attack her. She also, at the tail end, has this kicker of he's also been doing cocaine.
The toxicology revealed that John had been drinking, but not that much. It was barely over the legal limit. There certainly was no stimulants in his system, as she had indicated.
Instead of confronting Marique with the inconsistencies and giving her the chance to fabricate a new story, detectives ask her to walk them through the shooting again, this time with cameras rolling.
I'm just simply trying to get to the truth. So, knocking on that door and then requesting to do a walkthrough with her basically out of the blue, essentially, she complied with that, which really surprised me.
Sometimes when people are walking through a scene and describing things, you get little hints, or sometimes they make motions with their hands or pantomime something or reveal accidentally.
So John was sitting here, and I said, "John, you need to leave."
You guys are at this distance?
We're at this distance. My gun was like this.
During the initial walkthrough, Marique's version of events aligns with her original statement.
At this point in time, I asked Marique, can you stop playing yourself and now be John? She kind of came over the top of the couch and swiped, but the way that she swiped at me, with me pretending to be her, was more or less at my stomach area, basically where one would typically be holding a gun. During her initial interview with me, Marique told me that John swung at her or tried to punch her in some fashion.
It didn't seem like John was trying to attack, but maybe more just defend himself against a weapon that's been brought out. So we were seeing that in real time.
Do you think he was trying to grab that for the gun?
He either was grabbing for the gun or grabbing for me.
To detectives, it seems clear John was simply trying to escape.
At the edge of that couch is the top of the stairway, where that's the only way to get out of the house, unless if John jumps out the patio, which is 2 stories high.
He was being held at gunpoint. It would not be unreasonable for him to try to knock the gun aside or to try to get away from that threat.
After the walkthrough, Marique and her son are brought in for follow-up interviews. Investigators place them in separate rooms, hoping the pressure will cause one of them to crack.
When we talked to Cole, that changed everything.
I asked Cole, okay, so was there going to be this fight? Was there going to be this argument? Did you guys raise your voices at each other? And Cole said no. That actually John was trying to apologize to him for the way he was acting. And that was a huge red flag for me because it completely contradicted what Marique had said.
In the other room, detectives ask Marique to comment on what her son has just revealed. Marique fails to contradict his statement.
She seemed to really start folding in on herself. Her body language changed, and it was very apparent she did not have a good excuse. He had asked, why didn't you leave? You know, there was no reason to stay. If you wanted him to leave, you could have left just the same. You had a phone, you could have called the police.
Marique eventually made the statement of, well, I had two choices. I had my gun and I had my cell phone, and I chose the gun.
This is not a self-defense case. It is a homicide.
After reviewing the evidence with the district attorney, investigators secure an arrest warrant for Marique Ruth and bring her in on March 15th, 2023.
She was appointed an attorney, and she declined to continue to talk to us.
During pretrial hearings, Marique's lawyer asks to exclude her previous husband's death on the grounds that it might prejudice the jury.
They didn't want to make her look like a black widow, I guess.
The judge agrees, ruling any mention of Dustin Ruth inadmissible. Despite the setback, the prosecution remains confident.
There's no issues really at all from us because we're concentrated on John Killen.
On May 13th, 2024, Marique's trial begins.
I was called to the witness stand as the lead detective, and I walked the court and the jurors through the facts and circumstances of this case.
He was showing his interview video where she's just giving up information on her past history.
Just by more or less accident, she mentions her ex-husband during that video, and the defense attorney objected.
The judge immediately declares a mistrial, deciding that Marique would be retried with a new jury. 6 months later, on October 30th, 2024, the second trial begins. This time, prosecutors focus on the reason why Marique chose to shoot John Killen.
The motive for this case is born out of anger.
I got the feeling that Marique was afraid of losing John. And John talking about Cassie all the time probably really dug into her jealousy issues.
Marique claims she acted in self-defense, but the state argues nothing could be further from the truth. They say Marique decided that if she couldn't have John, no one could.
She decided to shoot him, and I think she had a thought that all I have to say is, I'm afraid for my life, and she would get away with it.
After a 5-day trial, the jury retires to deliberate.
They took about 2 hours and came back with guilty of first-degree murder.
When you're convicted of murder in the first degree, the mandatory sentence in Iowa is life without parole.
She's where she belongs. She just is. I truly believe that she's evil.
John didn't deserve to die. He had demons, but overall, his caring and his goofiness and, his love that he had for people over-trumped those demons.
My dad will be remembered for the kind-hearted man that he was from the moment he woke up to when he went to bed.
Cassie and I are doing the best we can with our kids. We have a great little family. I just wish that he was still here to be a part of it.
I love him so much. I was a daddy's girl. There's this bear that Mom put his voice inside of it. I squeeze it, and then he would say, "Tell Sissy I love her." I'm gonna have it forever.
New York 1987 cold case solved. Final confession exposes decades-old truth. It begins with a sound no one can agree on. Not a scream. Not exactly. Something sharper. Shorter. Cut off too quickly to become anything recognizable. A noise that didn't belong, but didn't last long enough to be questioned. December 14th, 1987. Upper Manhattan. The kind of neighborhood that moved in repetition. Same footsteps, same faces, same lights flickering on at the same hour every night. Routine wasn't just comfort here, it was identity. Predictable, safe, untouched by the chaos crawling through the rest of New York. Nothing ever happened here, until something did, and no one realized it in time. Her name was Evelyn Carter, 32 years old, freelance illustrator. Lived alone in a narrow apartment overlooking 112th Street. The kind of place where sound traveled through walls and privacy was an illusion, but no one ever complained about her. She was quiet, always had been. Neighbors described her in fragments. Polite. Keeps to herself. Always working. She followed patterns so precise they became part of the building's rhythm. Coffee at 7:15. Window cracked open, even in winter, letting the cold air mix with the faint hum of jazz records spinning late into the night. That night, the music didn't stop. It just looped. A soft crackle between grooves. Again, and again, and again. No one noticed. Not until 2 days later. The landlord forced the door after complaints about the noise, low, constant, unnatural in its repetition. When the door gave way, nothing inside made sense. There was no chaos, no overturned furniture, no shattered glass, no sign of struggle. The bed was made with tight corners, the sink empty, a coat hung neatly by the door, her shoes aligned beneath it as if placed with intention. Everything was exactly where it should be, except her. Evelyn Carter was gone. No note, no trace, no explanation, just absence. The kind that doesn't echo. The kind that settles. The first report didn't carry urgency. Adult female. Possibly voluntary departure. No immediate evidence of foul play. Detectives assigned, but not aggressively. New York in 1987 had louder crimes demanding attention. Murders with blood, robberies with witnesses, violence that couldn't be ignored. This wasn't one of those. This was quiet. And quiet cases disappear faster than people do. But something about it lingered. A detail too clean, too controlled. Like someone had erased her instead of taking her. The first anomaly surfaced buried in routine data, a phone call logged at 11:43 p.m. the night she vanished. Placed from her apartment. Dialed to a number that no longer existed. Disconnected. Unregistered. Untraceable. Detectives flagged it, noted it, filed it away, but it didn't fit, because everything else was silent. No neighbors reported voices, no arguments, no disturbance beyond that single, uncertain sound no one could define. The building remained still, undisturbed, as if whatever happened inside her apartment never needed to be loud. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Leads dissolved. Friends offered nothing new, just repetitions of the same description. Quiet, routine, stable. No known enemies. No recent conflicts. No sudden behavioral shifts that would suggest she planned to leave. But there were cracks. Small ones. Easily overlooked. She had canceled a meeting the day before she disappeared. Unusual, but not alarming. She had ignored 2 phone calls from a close acquaintance. Also unusual, but not enough to trigger concern at the time. Individually, they meant nothing. Together, they formed something else. A shift. Subtle. Quiet. But real. The apartment was re-examined weeks later. Slower this time. More deliberate. Detectives moved through it with a different lens, not looking for what was obvious, but for what didn't belong. That's when they found it. A sketch. Tucked beneath a stack of loose papers on her work desk. Not framed. Not signed. Almost hidden. It didn't look like her usual work. It was rough. Uneven.
Urgent.
A figure stood in the center of the page. Faceless. Still. Inside a space that resembled her apartment, but the angles were wrong. The perspective twisted. Walls stretched too far. Shadows bent in ways that didn't align with any real light source. And the position of the figure. It stood directly in line with the door. As if waiting. Or watching. Detectives debated its meaning. Some dismissed it as abstract. Others weren't convinced. Because Evelyn Carter didn't draw like that.
Her known work was precise.
Controlled. Structured. This wasn't. This looked reactive. Like something drawn under pressure. Or fear. The case shifted slightly after that. Not enough to change its trajectory, but enough to introduce a new word whispered quietly between investigators. Staged. Not in reports. Not officially. But in tone. Because the apartment didn't feel abandoned. It felt arranged. Placed back into order after something had disrupted it.
Carefully. Deliberately.
Winter turned to spring. Spring to summer. The city moved on. The case did not. It simply slowed. Until it stopped. No body meant no closure. No suspect meant no direction. And without direction, the case drifted into storage, boxed, labeled, and filed away among dozens of others that never found answers. Another cold case. Another name fading into paperwork. But time doesn't erase everything. Sometimes it buries things. And sometimes it exposes them. January 1988. A man from the 3rd floor came forward.
Late. Too late, some said.
He was an insomniac. A detail that made him unreliable to some, but observant to others. He claimed he had heard something that night. Footsteps. Not unusual in an apartment building. But these were different. Measured.
Heavy.
Not leaving. Arriving. He heard them stop outside Evelyn's door. Then nothing. Then that sound. That same sharp, undefined noise. And then silence.
Complete.
Unbroken. He didn't report it at the time. Said he thought nothing of it. Said the city trained people to ignore what didn't involve them. By the time he spoke up, memory had already begun its slow erosion. Details softened. Timing blurred. But one thing stayed consistent. The footsteps didn't rush. They didn't hesitate. They moved with purpose. That detail stuck. Because it suggested control. Confidence. Not panic. Which meant whoever stood outside that door that night knew exactly what they were doing. The investigation reopened briefly. Timelines adjusted. Possibilities reconsidered. But there was nothing to anchor it. No physical evidence. No witness confirmation. Just sound. And memory. And both were unreliable. The case cooled again. Harder this time. Colder. Years passed. New detectives cycled through. Some skimmed the file out of obligation. Others ignored it entirely. The city had changed. Crime patterns shifted. New cases demanded attention. Evelyn Carter became a name in a drawer, until one detail, small, overlooked, refused to stay buried. The window, always open, even in winter. Neighbors remembered that clearly. It was part of her routine. But when investigators reviewed the original report again, something didn't align. The window had been closed when the landlord entered. Latched. Tight. That didn't make sense. Not for Evelyn. Not for someone so rigid in habit. Which meant one of two things. She closed it herself that night. Or someone else did. And that detail, small, almost invisible, shifted the entire tone of the case. Because it introduced something new. Presence. Someone had been inside that apartment long enough to notice what should be changed. Long enough to restore order. Long enough to leave no trace. And that possibility didn't fade. It waited, quietly, for decades, until the silence finally broke. The silence didn't break all at once. It fractured. Slow. Uneven. Like something buried too long finally forcing its way back to the surface, piece by piece, detail by detail, each one sharper than the last. For 16 years, Evelyn Carter existed only in absence. A missing person without a body. A file without resolution. A name that had stopped being spoken out loud. Until 2003. The call came from the Bronx. A demolition site. Old storage building scheduled for teardown. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would have drawn attention beyond permits and paperwork. The kind of place forgotten by everyone except the city records that kept it alive on paper. Workers had already stripped half the interior when they found it. A wall that shouldn't have been there. Not structurally. Not originally. It was thinner than the others. Poorly integrated. The kind of addition meant to hide, not to support. One of the workers noticed the difference when his tool hit it, hollow, instead of solid. They broke through it in under 3 minutes. Behind it was a space no bigger than a closet. Sealed. Airless. Undisturbed. And inside a box. Cardboard. Reinforced with tape that had yellowed with age but held firm. No markings. No labels. No indication it had ever been meant to be found. For a moment, no one touched it. There's a hesitation that happens when something feels wrong but hasn't revealed why yet. Instinct without evidence. The workers felt it. Then someone opened it. The smell came first. Not decay. Not rot. Something older. Stale. Contained. Inside were objects. Carefully placed. Not thrown in. Not rushed. Arranged. A scarf. Folded neatly. A set of keys. Bound together with a thin metal ring. A small leather notebook. And beneath them a sketchbook. Detectives were called immediately. The site was sealed within hours. And by the time the contents were cataloged, one name had already surfaced. Evelyn Carter. The reaction inside the precinct wasn't excitement. It was disbelief. Because cases like hers weren't supposed to come back. Not like this. Not with physical evidence. Not after 16 years. But there it was, real, tangible, undeniable. The box didn't just reopen the investigation. It redefined it. This was no longer a disappearance. This was preservation. Someone had taken pieces of Evelyn's life and hidden them with intention. Not destroyed. Not discarded. Kept. That word changed everything. Because keeping meant memory. And memory meant purpose. The items were processed immediately. Forensics worked with urgency that hadn't existed in 1987. Techniques had evolved. Possibilities expanded. But time had done what it always does. It erased what mattered most. No usable DNA. No viable prints. Nothing that could tie the objects directly to a suspect. But the arrangement told its own story. This wasn't random. This wasn't chaotic. This was controlled. Every item placed as if it had significance. The scarf, identified by a former neighbor as something Evelyn wore frequently during winter. The keys, confirmed to belong to her apartment. The notebook, filled with quick sketches, fragments of ideas, nothing overtly alarming. Until they reached the sketchbook. The second one. Not the one found in her apartment in 1987. Another. Unknown. Unseen. Untouched for 16 years. When they opened it, the room shifted. Page 1, a figure. Rough. Undefined. Standing in darkness. Page 2, the same figure. Closer. Page 3, closer still. The drawings progressed. Not in skill. In proximity. Each page pulling the figure nearer, clearer, but never fully revealed. Always faceless. Always incomplete. But the environment changed. Subtle at first. Then unmistakable. The background began to resemble her apartment. The narrow space. The placement of furniture. The angle of the window. Distorted, but recognizable. Which meant these weren't imagined. They were observed. Or remembered. Detectives flipped faster. Page after page. The figure moved. Not physically. Positionally. From the corner. To the center. To the door. Waiting. And then the final page. No drawing. Just words. Written harder than anything else in the book, as if pressed into the paper with force. He was already inside. No signature. No date. But the handwriting matched Evelyn's. That confirmation hit like impact, because it rewrote the entire narrative. The original assumption had been simple. Someone came to the door. Knocked. Entered. Took her. But this suggested something else entirely. No forced entry. No sign of struggle. No noise. Because there had been no intrusion. He hadn't entered. He had been there. Already. Before anything happened. The implications spread through the investigation like a shockwave. Access. That was the word now. Who had access? Who could be inside her apartment without raising alarm? Without breaking locks? Without being questioned? The list wasn't long. Landlord. Maintenance. Building staff. People who existed in the background, visible enough to be ignored. Invisible enough to move freely. Records were pulled. Old employment logs dusted off. Names surfaced. Most led nowhere, retired, relocated, dead. But one didn't resolve cleanly. A maintenance worker. Part-time. Temporary. Assigned to the building for just under 3 months in late 1987. No full name in the system. Just an initial. No social security number on file. No forwarding address. No termination record. It was as if he had been inserted into the system and then removed. Cleanly. Too cleanly. Detectives leaned in. Because absence like that doesn't happen by accident. They tracked what little they had. Timesheets. Payment logs. Handwritten notes from a supervisor long since retired. And then a memory. A tenant interview buried in the original case file. Overlooked. Dismissed. Until now. The tenant had described a man. Didn't know his name. Didn't remember his face clearly. But remembered his behavior. He knocked on doors without reason. Checked locks. Lingered in hallways longer than necessary. Not in a way that triggered alarm. Just enough to feel off. At the time, it had meant nothing. Now it meant everything. Because it aligned. Access. Presence. Familiarity. He wouldn't have needed to force entry. He would have had keys. Or worse. Permission. The timeline tightened. The window detail resurfaced. Evelyn always left it open. But it had been found closed. Which meant whoever had been inside had stayed long enough afterward to notice it. To correct it. To restore order. That wasn't panic. That was control. The investigation gained momentum for the first time in over a decade. But momentum without identity is directionless. And they still didn't have a name. Just a shadow moving through old records. The sketchbook became the center. Psychological analysis. Behavioral profiling. Experts examined the drawings, not as art, but as evidence. The progression suggested observation over time. Not a single event. Not a single night. This wasn't sudden. This was built. Slowly. Deliberately. Which meant Evelyn had sensed it. Felt it. Documented it. But never escaped it. And that realization brought something darker into focus. This hadn't been a random act. It had been a process. One that began long before December 14th and ended without a trace. The case expanded outward. Other buildings, other tenants, other temporary workers. Patterns were searched for. Disappearances cross-referenced. Nothing definitive, but enough fragments to suggest possibility. And possibility was enough to keep it alive. For a while. But investigations need more than possibility. They need proof. And proof remained just out of reach. Again, the case stalled. Not closed. Not forgotten. But suspended. Waiting. For something else. Something human. Because evidence can only take you so far. Eventually, someone has to speak. And for years, no one did. Until decades later. Someone finally would. But when that moment came, it wouldn't bring relief. It wouldn't bring closure. It would bring something far more unsettling. Because the truth, when it finally surfaced, would reveal that the most dangerous thing about that night in 1987 wasn't how it ended, but how long it had been happening before anyone realized. Time didn't move forward for this case. It circled, back through records, back through names, back through moments that had once felt insignificant and now pulsed with a different weight. The kind of weight that only exists when you realize something was missed the first time. Because something had been missed. Not one thing. Many. Small. Quiet. Easy to ignore. Until they weren't. The sketchbook changed how detectives looked at everything. Not just what happened on December 14th, 1987, but what had been happening before it. The drawings weren't documenting a single encounter. They were tracking a presence. A pattern. And patterns leave traces, even when people don't. They went back to the building. Not the way it was remembered, but the way it existed now. Renovated. Repainted. Rewired. Layers of time covering what used to be there. New tenants. New locks. New lives unfolding in the same space where something had once gone terribly wrong. Most of them had never heard the name Evelyn Carter. That was expected. But what wasn't expected was how many of them described the same feeling. Not constantly. Not even clearly. Just occasionally. A sense that something was off. Doors that didn't feel fully closed. Objects slightly out of place. The kind of thing people blame on themselves because the alternative feels unreasonable. Detectives didn't write that down in official reports. But they heard it. And it stayed. They focused instead on what could be proven. The access points. Maintenance logs from 1987 had already shown irregularities, gaps, missing signatures, incomplete schedules. But now they were examined differently. Not as administrative errors, but as intentional absences. Someone had moved through that system without leaving a proper record. Someone who understood how records worked and how to avoid them. The partial name, just an initial, became an obsession. They cross-referenced it with city employment archives, union registrations, subcontractor lists. Thousands of names. Hundreds of possibilities. Most eliminated quickly. Some took longer. None matched completely. Until one came close. Not perfect, but close enough to pause. A man who had worked short-term maintenance jobs across multiple boroughs in the mid-1980s. No stable address. Paid in irregular intervals. Frequently listed under slightly different versions of the same name. Never staying long. Never leaving a clear trail. His record stopped in early 1988. Just stopped. No death certificate. No relocation. No continued employment. Another disappearance. But unlike Evelyn, no one had reported him missing. Because men like that don't get reported. They fade. But fading isn't the same as vanishing. And detectives knew that. They tracked what they could. Old landlords. Former coworkers. Anyone who might have crossed paths with him. Most remembered nothing. Or said they did. Memory is unreliable when it wants to be. But one account stood out. A former supervisor. Retired. Living upstate. He didn't remember the name at first. But he remembered the behavior. Said the man was quiet. Too quiet. Not shy, controlled. Like someone who measured what they revealed. He didn't socialize. Didn't linger. But he watched. That word again. watched. The supervisor described moments where he'd catch the man standing still, longer than necessary, focused on something that didn't require attention. A hallway, a door, a person passing by. Not enough to report, but enough to notice. At the time, it had meant nothing. Now it meant something else. The supervisor also recalled something more specific. A complaint. Unofficial. A tenant who had mentioned someone entering her apartment while she was out. Nothing stolen. Nothing broken. Just disturbed. Items moved slightly. Subtle. Easy to dismiss. The complaint never became a report. The man had been reassigned shortly after. Then gone. The timeline aligned too closely to ignore. Detectives pressed further. If that behavior existed before Evelyn, then she might not have been the first. That realization shifted the scale of the investigation. They expanded the search, not just for him, but for others. Unreported incidents, minor complaints, unexplained entries, anything that matched the pattern of presence without force. Cases surfaced. Not many, but enough. Different boroughs, different buildings, same details. No theft, no violence, just the feeling that someone had been there, inside, without permission, without trace. The pattern stretched back years. And then, it stopped. Around the same time, Evelyn disappeared. That wasn't coincidence. That was escalation. Something had changed. Something had crossed a line. The question wasn't what happened that night anymore. It was why that night? Why her? Why then? The answer wasn't in the records. It was in her. Evelyn Carter stopped being just a victim. She became the center. They rebuilt her final months in greater detail than before. Not surface-level routines, but deeper patterns. Who she spoke to, where she went, what she noticed. And slowly, a shift emerged. Subtle at first, then undeniable. She had started staying home more, canceling plans, ignoring calls, not randomly, consistently, as if something outside had become less safe than staying inside. But that didn't make sense, because whatever took her came from inside. The contradiction tightened the tension, until one detail bridged it. Her sketches, not just the ones found, all of them. Her work archive was reviewed in full, pieces stored by clients, galleries, friends. Dozens of sketches spanning months before her disappearance. Most were ordinary, until they weren't, because once you knew what to look for, you saw it. A shape, a figure, sometimes barely visible. In the background, in reflections, in negative space. Not consistent, not obvious, but present. Growing more defined over time. The same progression seen in the final sketchbook, which meant she had been seeing it longer than anyone realized, or believing she was. The distinction mattered, because it introduced doubt. Was she being watched? Or did she think she was? Was the figure real? Or something her mind constructed? Detectives debated it. Psychologists weighed in. Paranoia, stress, isolation, all possible. All plausible, but none of them explained the box. None of them explained the missing woman. None of them explained the closed window. Because paranoia doesn't leave physical evidence. Someone had been there. That wasn't a question anymore. The only question left was how long. The answer began to form from an unexpected place. Electricity records. Not of her apartment. Of the building. Usage patterns from late 1987 showed small fluctuations during hours when activity should have been minimal. Lights turning on briefly. Circuits activating and deactivating. Not enough to raise suspicion, but enough to notice in hindsight. Movement. At night. When people were asleep. When doors were closed. When no one would question a presence in the hallway. Access again. Always access. It circled back to the same point. Whoever had done this had belonged there. Not officially, not permanently, but enough. Enough to move unseen. Enough to learn routines. Enough to wait. And waiting, that was the part that changed everything. Because waiting meant patience. And patience meant planning. which meant December 14th wasn't the beginning. It was the moment everything aligned. The moment opportunity met intention. The moment observation became action. And something else, something colder, started to surface. Because if he had been inside before she arrived that night, then he had waited, in her space, listening, watching, knowing exactly when to move. The image settled over the case like a shadow that wouldn't lift. It changed how every detail felt. The untouched apartment, the controlled environment, the absence of struggle. Because there may not have been time for one. If she never saw him coming, if he was already there, then the night didn't begin with a knock. It began with presence. Silent, hidden, unavoidable. The case didn't need more evidence to feel different now. It needed something else. Something human. Because patterns can only take you so far. At some point, someone has to break. And somewhere out there, if he was still alive, he carried it. All of it. The waiting, the watching, the moment. And people like that don't confess easily. They hold on until something forces them not to. And when that moment comes, it doesn't just reveal what happened. It reveals who they really were all along. And for this case, that moment was getting closer, whether anyone was ready for it or not. By the time the case reached its 4th decade, it no longer felt like an investigation. It felt like something unfinished, not dormant, not forgotten, just waiting. Files had grown heavier, not with answers, but with layers. Old reports stacked against new interpretations. Witness statements reread under different assumptions. Every detail pulled apart, reassembled, questioned again. Because something about it refused to settle. And the more they looked, the more one idea kept resurfacing. He hadn't just been watching. He had been learning. The pattern of presence, those subtle entries into apartments, the objects slightly moved, the doors not quite as they were left, wasn't random behavior. It wasn't curiosity. It was rehearsal. That realization didn't come from a single breakthrough. It came from accumulation. Case by case. Detail by detail. Each small incident that once seemed isolated now aligned into something more structured. Intentional. Whoever he was, he didn't start with Evelyn. He built toward her. That thought changed the emotional gravity of everything. Because it meant she hadn't been chosen by chance. She had been selected. And selection requires criteria. The detectives turned their focus fully toward her again, not as a victim of opportunity, but as the endpoint of a process. Why her apartment? Why her routine? Why that building? The answers didn't come easily, but they came. Slow. Uncomfortable. Evelyn's routines weren't just consistent. They were predictable to the minute. Her work kept her home for long stretches. Her social circle was limited. She didn't entertain guests often. And most importantly, she trusted the space she lived in. That trust created vulnerability. A space where someone could observe without being challenged. A space where small intrusions could go unnoticed. At first. Until they didn't. The sketches made that clear. She had noticed something. Not immediately, but gradually. A feeling first. Then a suspicion. Then a pattern. And finally, a presence. The progression in her drawings mirrored that psychological shift. The figure wasn't just getting closer physically. It was becoming more real to her. More defined. More unavoidable. Which raised a new possibility. What if she had realized the truth before that night? What if she knew? And no one listened? That question pushed investigators back into her final week with renewed urgency. Every interaction re-examined. Every canceled plan reconsidered. Every silence questioned. And then they found it. A message. Not in police records. Not in official statements. But in a personal letter recovered from a friend years after the original investigation had closed. The friend hadn't thought it mattered at the time. Now it mattered more than anything. The letter was short, uneven, written in a tone that didn't match the Evelyn everyone described. There was hesitation in the handwriting, pressure in certain words, as if she had stopped and started more than once while writing it. It didn't name anyone, didn't describe anything directly, but the language was clear enough to disturb. "I think someone has been inside." That was the line that shifted the room when detectives read it. Not "someone broke in." Not "someone tried to get in." Inside. Present. Already there. She described small things. Objects not where she left them. A window she remembered closing, suddenly open. Then closed again later. Sounds at night that didn't match the building's usual rhythm. Nothing dramatic. Nothing provable. Just enough to create doubt. And doubt, left alone long enough, becomes fear. The letter ended without resolution. No follow-up. No report filed. No escalation. She had written it, then kept living, as if unsure whether what she felt was real, or something she couldn't explain. That hesitation may have cost her everything, because if she had been certain, if she had acted, maybe that night would have been different. But certainty is rare when nothing is visible, and whoever he was, he understood that. He operated in the space between reality and doubt, where people question themselves before they question anything else. That was his advantage, and he used it. The investigation pivoted again, this time not just toward identity, but toward behavior. Profilers re-entered the case with fresh perspective, not to build a profile from scratch, but to refine what had been overlooked. They focused on control, not violence, not impulse, control. Everything about the case pointed to it. The untouched apartment, the lack of struggle, the preserved items, the careful concealment. Even the sketches suggested a slow, deliberate escalation rather than a sudden act. This wasn't someone driven by chaos. This was someone driven by precision, routine, observation, a need to remain unseen, which narrowed the field in a different way. People like that don't disappear easily. They adapt. They blend. They age. But they carry patterns with them. And patterns eventually surface. The problem was time. 30+ years had passed. Faces change. Names change. Lives shift. But behavior leaves echoes. So they looked for echoes. Across cities. Across decades. Similar incidents. Similar complaints. Similar absences. And one pattern emerged stronger than the rest. Not tied to a name. Not tied to a location. But tied to a method. Unauthorized entries, without theft. Objects repositioned. Windows altered. Always subtle. Always deniable. The reports were scattered. Rare. But consistent. And then, nothing. After 1987, the pattern stopped. Completely. As if whatever had been building had reached its conclusion. That was the part that unsettled everyone. Because it suggested satisfaction. Completion. Evelyn wasn't just a victim. She was the end. The final act of something that had been unfolding quietly for years. And after that, he didn't need to continue. Or chose not to. Which meant one of two things. He was gone. Or he had changed. Either way, the trail went cold again. But not the same kind of cold as before. This wasn't absence. This was containment. The truth was there. Somewhere. Held by someone. And time was running in a different direction now. Because whoever he was, if he was still alive, he was aging. And aging changes people. It weakens control. It loosens restraint. It creates something investigators know well. The need to unburden. Confession doesn't come from pressure alone. It comes from weight. And weight accumulates. Over years. Over decades. Until it becomes too much to carry in silence. The detectives didn't say it out loud. But they felt it. The case wasn't just waiting for evidence anymore. It was waiting for him. For the moment when something inside him would shift. Crack. Break. Because when it did, everything would surface at once. Not just the act, but the years behind it. The waiting. The watching. The time spent inside spaces that didn't belong to him. The nights he stood in darkness, unseen, unheard. Close enough to touch a life, without being part of it. That was the truth buried inside this case. Not just what happened, but how long it had been happening. And how easily it had gone unnoticed. That realization carried a different kind of fear, because it wasn't confined to 1987. It wasn't confined to one building. It spoke to something broader, something quieter, something that could exist anywhere, at any time, without detection. And that thought lingered long after the reports were filed, long after the evidence was stored, long after the leads faded again. Because even without a name, even without a face, they knew one thing with certainty now. He had been real. He had been there. And for one night in December 1987, he had stopped waiting. The only question left was what it took for him to finally speak. And when he did, what he would choose to reveal first. The act itself, or the years of silence that made it possible. The break didn't come from evidence. It came from time. Not the kind that erases, but the kind that wears something down from the inside, slowly, invisibly, until whatever has been held in place for decades begins to slip. For years after the Bronx discovery, the case hovered in a strange state, no longer forgotten, but not advancing. Detectives rotated in and out, each one absorbing the same weight, the same fragments, the same unsettling pattern that never quite formed a complete picture. Until one of them stopped looking for what was missing and started looking for what had changed. Because if the man they were searching for had lived through all those years, if he had aged, adapted, disappeared into the ordinary, then something about him now would be different from who he'd been in 1987. Not externally. Internally. People who carry secrets like that don't remain static. They shift. They compensate. And eventually, they leak. The idea wasn't new, but it hadn't been applied to this case with precision before. They began tracking not suspects but anomalies. Unexplained behaviors in older men. Minor incidents that didn't escalate. Complaints that didn't lead anywhere. Quiet disturbances reported and then dismissed. They combed through decades of small, forgettable reports. Not crimes. Irregularities. And one category stood out. Trespassing without theft. Private spaces entered. Nothing taken. Nothing broken. Just presence. Most of these incidents were written off at the time. A confused neighbor. A misplaced memory. Someone forgetting they had moved something themselves. But patterns don't care about explanations. They align anyway. A cluster of reports from the late 1990s surfaced first. Queens. Brooklyn. Parts of northern New Jersey. Different buildings. Same details. Doors found unlocked. Windows slightly altered. Items moved, barely enough to notice. No forced entry. No witnesses. And then, silence again. The pattern faded out by the early 2000s. Just like before. That repetition mattered. Because it suggested continuation. Not of the act, but of the behavior. He hadn't stopped entirely after 1987. He had adapted. Scaled down. Reduced risk. But the compulsion. That remained. And compulsion leaves traces. The next step was narrowing. Time frames. Geography. Movement. They overlaid the incidents with demographic data. Who lived in those buildings, who had access, who moved frequently, who left minimal documentation. A name didn't emerge, but a profile sharpened. Male. Transient employment history. Comfortable with maintenance or building systems. Avoids long-term attachment. Prefers environments where presence can be explained or ignored. That profile wasn't rare, but it wasn't common either. And it aligned with something else. A quiet arrest in 2004. So Minard had never been linked to anything larger. A man detained for entering a private storage area in Queens. No theft. No damage. Just presence. He claimed confusion. Said he thought he had permission. There was no evidence to contradict him. He was released with a warning. No charges pursued. At the time, it was nothing. Now, it was something. The file was pulled. Thin. Barely detailed. But it had what the original case never did. A name. Not confirmed. Not proven. But recorded. It wasn't an exact match to the partial identity from 1987. But it was close enough to hold attention. Similar structure. Similar inconsistencies in documentation. Different variations used over time. The kind of identity that shifts just enough to avoid continuity. Detectives followed it carefully. Because cases like this don't tolerate assumptions. They traced his history.
Or what existed of it.
Short-term jobs. Maintenance, janitorial, building access roles. Never staying long. Always moving. Addresses that overlapped with areas where incidents had been reported. Not perfectly, but consistently enough to matter. And then, another gap. After 2005, the trail thinned. Not completely gone, but quieter. As if whatever behavior had driven him had slowed. Or been contained. Aging. That was the simplest explanation. But aging doesn't remove patterns. It softens them. Reduces frequency. Not intent. Which meant he could still be out there. Still carrying it. All of it. And that brought a different kind of urgency. Because time was no longer working against the investigation. It was working against him. If he spoke, it would be soon. Or not at all. They didn't know where he was. Not exactly. But they knew how to find pressure points. Medical systems. Housing assistance. Public records that track aging populations who no longer move as freely. They cast a wide net. Not to accuse. To observe. And slowly, the edges of his life began to appear. An address. Temporary. Low-income housing. Queens. No family listed. No emergency contact. Minimal interaction with neighbors. He existed the same way he always had. On the edge. Visible enough to function. Invisible enough to disappear. Surveillance wasn't immediate. They watched first. From distance. Patterns. Movement. Behavior. Days passed. Then weeks. Nothing. He moved like any other elderly man.
Slow.
Routine-based. Limited. If this was the man. Time had changed him. But something didn't sit right. Not with the detectives who had lived inside this case long enough to recognize when something was being concealed behind normalcy. Because normalcy can be performed. And performance requires effort. Then it happened.
Small.
Almost nothing. A report from within the building. A tenant complained that someone had entered her storage locker. Nothing missing. Just disturbed. Items slightly out of place. The door not secured the way she left it. The detail hit instantly. Because it was familiar. Too familiar. The same pattern. Decades later. Reduced. Contained. But still there. They didn't move immediately. They watched. Waited. And then, another incident. Different tenant. Same building. Same details. Presence without purpose. That was enough. Not for arrest. Not for accusation. But for contact. They approached carefully. Not as suspects confronting a criminal. As investigators opening a conversation. Because with cases like this, the first words matter more than anything else. He answered the door slowly. 81 years old.
Frail.
Unremarkable. The kind of man no one notices twice. His eyes didn't give anything away. Not fear. Not recognition. Just awareness. They asked simple questions. Routine.
Non threatening.
He responded calmly.
Cooperatively.
Nothing in his tone suggested tension. But something in the space between his answers.
Did.
A pause too long. A glance that lingered just slightly off. Micro-behaviors that don't register to most people. But to those trained to see them, they signal something else. Not guilt. Not yet. But containment. They didn't push.
Not then.
They left. But they knew. Not with certainty. But with enough. Enough to return. Enough to wait. Because pressure applied too early breaks the wrong way. And whatever this man carried had been held in place for decades. It wouldn't come out under force. It would come out under weight. And that weight was already there. Building. Quietly. Inside him. The next move wouldn't be aggressive. It would be patient. Because they weren't just trying to solve a case anymore. They were waiting for something older than evidence. Older than records. Older than time itself. They were waiting for confession. And when it came, it wouldn't sound like relief. It would sound like something finally giving up the effort of staying hidden. Something that had been inside too long, finally stepping into the light. And when it did, it would carry everything with it. Not just the night Evelyn Carter disappeared, but the years before it. The watching, the waiting, the slow, deliberate crossing of a line no one had seen forming. Because the truth in this case was never just about what happened. It was about how long it had been allowed to happen unnoticed. And that truth was closer now than it had ever been. Close enough to feel, close enough to hear, just beneath the surface, waiting to be spoken. They didn't bring him in right away. That would have been too abrupt, too direct. And cases like this, cases that survive for decades without resolution, don't break under force. They fracture under pressure that builds slowly, deliberately, until the person holding the truth begins to feel it from every direction. So they waited. Not passively, carefully. They watched his routines, the way he moved through the building, the times he left his apartment, the length of his walks, the routes he chose. It wasn't about catching him doing something illegal anymore. It was about understanding how much of the past still lived inside his present. Because behavior doesn't disappear. It evolves. And even in age, even in physical decline, patterns leave residue. At first, everything appeared ordinary. Morning walks, slow, measured. A pause at the same corner each day, as if remembering something, or waiting for nothing. Groceries purchased in small quantities. No visitors. No conversations longer than necessary. He existed quietly. Contained. But that was exactly the problem. Containment requires effort. And effort leaves cracks. They saw it in the way he handled keys. Too deliberate. Too aware. Not careless like most elderly residents who fumble, hesitate, forget. He didn't forget. He checked. Once. Twice. Sometimes 3 times before locking his door. Then there was the hallway. He never walked straight through it. He paused. Not long enough to attract attention. Just long enough to observe. Doors. Locks. Spaces between them. The kind of observation that doesn't belong to habit. It belongs to memory. And memory, when it's tied to something unresolved, doesn't fade cleanly. It lingers. They brought him in on the 3rd week. Not under arrest. Voluntary. A conversation. He agreed without resistance. That alone meant something. People who have nothing to hide often hesitate. People who have everything buried sometimes don't. The room was small. Neutral. No pressure in the environment itself. Just 2 detectives. And him. 81 years old. Hands steady. Eyes clear. Too clear. They didn't start with Evelyn. That would have closed him off instantly. Instead, they began with the present. The building. The complaints. Storage lockers. Small disturbances. Nothing accusatory. Just questions. He answered calmly. Said he didn't know anything about it. Said people forget things. Misplace items. Blame others. His tone was measured. Reasonable. Convincing. But not natural. There was a distance in his words. As if he had rehearsed responses for situations exactly like this. That wasn't proof. But it was alignment. They shifted slowly. Moved backward. Past incidents. Other buildings. Other years. Still nothing direct. Still nothing that forced him to confront anything specific. He remained composed. Until they introduced the pattern. Not as accusation. As observation. Entries without theft. That phrase landed differently. Not visibly. Not in a way most people would notice. But the room changed. Slightly. A pause. Barely there. Then he nodded. Once. As if acknowledging something internal. Not external. That was the first crack. They didn't push into it. Not yet. They let it sit. Silence can be more effective than pressure when someone is holding on to something that heavy. And he was. You could feel it now. Not in what he said, but in what he didn't. They continued. Spoke about behavior. About how some people enter spaces not to take, but to experience presence. To observe. To exist where they shouldn't. They kept their tone clinical, detached, like they were describing someone else. He listened, still, unmoving, but his breathing changed. Subtle, slower, deeper, as if something was being weighed inside him. That's when they shifted again. This time, to 1987. Not directly. They referenced the era, the city, the types of buildings, maintenance access, keys, structures that allowed movement without notice. And then, they said her name, Evelyn Carter. For the first time, he didn't react immediately. But reaction isn't always immediate. Sometimes it travels inward first, and then surfaces. His eyes moved. Just slightly. Not away, not toward. Just shifted. Like something had been recognized. Not consciously, but completely. They placed the sketchbook on the table. The second one, recovered from the box. They didn't open it. Not yet. They let it sit between them. A physical presence. A connection to something he couldn't dismiss as theory. He looked at it. Longer than necessary. Then back at them.
No denial.
No question. Just awareness. That was the moment the room changed. Because now, it wasn't abstract anymore. It was real. They opened it slowly. Turned the pages. One by one. The figure. Closer. 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 Each page a step forward. Each page a narrowing of distance. Until the final one. He was already inside. They didn't say anything after that. They didn't need to. Because the words did what no accusation could. They removed distance. Between him and the act. Between past and present. He stared at the page. Long enough for silence to become something else. Not empty. Heavy. Then he spoke. Not clearly. Not fully. But enough. That's not how it started. The sentence came out quietly. Almost detached. But it was everything. Because it wasn't denial. It was correction. The first sign that what he carried wasn't just memory. It was narrative. And narratives want to be told. They leaned in. Carefully. Didn't interrupt. Didn't rush. Because this was the edge. Where truth begins to surface. Or retreats permanently. He looked down at his hands. Not shaking. Not weak. Just still. And then he said something else. She noticed too early. That line changed everything. Because it confirmed what the sketches had suggested. She had seen it. Understood it. Before he was ready. Before he had planned for that. And that had altered the outcome. They asked nothing. They let him continue. Because once someone begins to speak after holding silence that long, they don't stop because of questions. They stop because of interruption. And interruption closes doors that may never open again. He exhaled slowly, like releasing something that had been held in place for too long. I wasn't supposed to be seen. The words weren't defensive. They weren't emotional. They were factual, as if describing a rule, a boundary, that had been broken. And that break had consequences. The room stayed still. No one moved. Because now, they weren't interviewing a suspect. They were listening to something that had been buried for 34 years. Something that didn't just explain a night, but everything leading up to it. And everything that followed. He looked at the sketchbook again. Then closed his eyes briefly. Not in regret. Not in pain. In recollection. As if stepping back into a space he had never fully left. When he opened them, they were different. Not softer. Not harder. Just present. Fully. For the first time. And when he spoke again, it wasn't fragments anymore. It was direction. I can tell you what happened. The sentence settled into the room like something final. Not a question. Not an offer. A decision. And decisions like that don't come twice. They come once. After decades of silence. After years of holding something in place that no longer wants to stay hidden. The detectives didn't respond immediately. They didn't acknowledge it. They just waited. Because what was coming next wouldn't just be a confession. It would be the unraveling of everything. The waiting. The watching. The presence inside spaces that were never his. And the moment when all of it crossed a line that couldn't be undone. The truth was there now. Not in evidence, not in theory, in him. And for the first time since December 14th, 1987, it was ready to be spoken. Out loud. Without interruption. Without silence to protect it. And once it began, there would be no putting it back. No returning to absence. No restoring the illusion that nothing had been there. Because something had. For a long time. Long enough to become part of the walls. Part of the space. Part of her life. Before she even knew it. And now, after all these years, it was about to be heard. He didn't begin with that night. Not immediately. Confessions like this don't move forward in straight lines. They circle. They hesitate. They test the space before committing to it. Because once something is said out loud after decades of silence, it doesn't return to where it was. It stays. He knew that. So he started earlier. Not with her. With himself. I didn't go there to take anything. His voice was steady. Not defensive. Not apologetic. Just precise. They always think that's the reason. He glanced briefly at one of the detectives, then back down at the table. But it wasn't. No one interrupted. He continued. It was the quiet. That word hung there for a moment. Quiet. Not as absence, but as something he sought. Places where no one was watching. Where nothing moved unless you moved it. Where you could stand still and exist without being seen. The explanation wasn't emotional. It was structured. As if he had thought about it before. Many times. They leave things behind, he said. People. They leave traces of themselves everywhere. Objects. Patterns. You can learn a lot without them being there. Observation. Always observation. The detectives didn't need to prompt it. He was giving it freely now. I started with buildings I worked in, he went on. Easy access. No questions. People trust uniforms. Keys. He paused. Not searching for words. Measuring them. At first, it was just doors. Locked. Unlocked. Which ones people checked. Which ones they didn't. A pattern forming. Early. Controlled. I never stayed long. That detail mattered. Even now, he was emphasizing restraint. Limits. Rules he had set for himself. They weren't supposed to notice. That word again. Notice. Everything in his world seemed to revolve around it. Avoiding it. Controlling it. Until. They usually didn't. The statement came with a quiet certainty. Because for years, they hadn't. I learned how to move, he said. When to go in. When to leave. What made noise. What didn't. He looked up again. Not at the detectives. Through them. As if the room had dissolved and he was somewhere else. Back there. Inside those spaces. I wasn't looking for people. That was important to him. Clarifying it. Separating intention from outcome. I waited until they were gone. A rule. Clear. Defined. And then, I broke it. The words came out softer. Not with regret, but with recognition. That something had shifted. And once it did, it couldn't be reversed. They let the silence stretch. Because this was where the line approached. The moment everything changed. She was different. He didn't say her name. He didn't need to. The context was already there. She had patterns. That word again. Patterns. Predictability. Structure. I watched for a while. No time frame. Just duration. Long enough to understand. Long enough to plan. I knew when she left. When she came back. When she turned the lights on. When she didn't. His voice remained even. Clinical. But the content. It carried weight. Because it wasn't random. It was deliberate. You can learn everything from repetition. That line explained everything. The waiting. The patience. The years of unnoticed presence. I didn't go in at first, he said. Not right away. Another boundary. Another step. I waited until I knew it was safe. Safe. For him. Not for her. That distinction didn't exist in his version. The detectives didn't challenge it. They let him build. because dismantling his narrative too early would shut it down. And they needed all of it. Every piece. I started small. A phrase that echoed through the entire case. Because that's exactly what the evidence had shown. Just standing inside. No movement. No interaction. Presence. I would leave things the way they were. Another rule. Control. I wasn't there to change anything, but he did. Eventually. Sometimes I moved something. There it was. The beginning of escalation. Just enough to see if she noticed. Testing. Observation turning into interaction. She didn't at first.
Of course she didn't.
Because it was subtle. Designed to be dismissed. But then, he stopped. The first real pause that wasn't measured. The first moment where something disrupted the flow. She started to look. That was the shift. The moment Evelyn crossed from unawareness into suspicion. I could tell. He didn't explain how. He didn't need to. Because everything about his behavior suggested he was watching closely enough to know. She changed things. Her routines. Her environment. Her awareness. She stayed home more. That aligned with what the investigation had uncovered. Canceled plans. Ignored calls. I wasn't supposed to be part of that. A rule broken again.
Not just by him,
but by her noticing. That's how he framed it. Not as his failure. As a disruption of the structure he had built. I should have stopped. The closest thing to acknowledgement. Not regret. Recognition. But recognition came too late. I didn't. The simplest statement. The heaviest. Because everything that followed existed inside those two words. He leaned back slightly. Not withdrawing. Just creating space. As if preparing to step into the part that mattered most. The night she disappeared. He said it without hesitation. No change in tone. No increase in emotion. Just continuation. I wasn't supposed to be there when she came back. Another rule. Broken again. Not intentionally. At least not in the way he described it. I misjudged the time. A small error. A human one. But in this context, it changed everything. I was already inside. The words echoed the sketchbook. Confirmed it.
Solidified it.
I heard her before I saw her. That detail landed differently. Because it placed him in the space.
Hidden.
Waiting. Unplanned. She came in, closed the door. Ordinary actions. Routine. Until they weren't. I stayed still.
Of course he did.
That was his method. Presence without detection. I thought she would notice. But she had changed. She turned toward the hallway. That's when it shifted. I don't know what she saw. That was the first uncertainty.
Real.
Uncontrolled. But she knew. Those 3 words carried everything. Recognition. Understanding.
Fear. She said something.
He paused again. Longer this time. As if the memory resisted being fully accessed. I don't remember the words. But he remembered the meaning. She wasn't confused. That mattered to him. Clarifying it. She knew someone was there. No doubt.
No ambiguity.
That's when the situation moved beyond his control. I stepped forward. The moment everything became irreversible. I didn't mean to. He stopped himself. Not correcting. Just halting. Because intent no longer mattered at that point. I couldn't stay hidden anymore. And that was the core of it. The entire structure of his behavior had depended on invisibility. Once that was gone, everything collapsed. She tried to move. A reaction. Natural. Immediate. I reached out. Another step. Closer. Closer than he had ever been. I didn't plan what happened next. The statement came quickly. Almost reflexive. But it didn't change anything. Because what happened next had already been set in motion long before that night. Through every entry, every observation, every moment he stood inside her space without being seen. All of it led there. To that point, where presence became confrontation. And confrontation became something else. He went quiet. Not because he had nothing to say, but because what came next couldn't be softened, couldn't be reframed, couldn't be contained the way everything before it had been. The detectives didn't move, didn't speak, didn't break the silence. Because this was the threshold. And once he crossed it, there would be no distance left between him and what he had done. No space for interpretation. No room for control. Just truth. Unfiltered. Unavoidable. After 34 years, it was finally there, waiting to be said. He didn't describe it like a scene. He described it like a collapse. Something that stops behaving according to rules the moment it is no longer contained. I stepped into the hallway, he said. Still calm. Still controlled. But it wasn't like before. A pause. Not hesitation. Recognition of change. Everything was different because she knew. That was the turning point for him. Not action. Awareness. Before that, it was always distance. He moved his hands slightly on the table, not gesturing, just grounding himself. Walls. Doors. Hallways. Spaces where I could decide when I was seen. He looked down. As long as I wasn't seen, I was in control. The detectives didn't interrupt. They were no longer guiding, only receiving. But that night, he continued, there was no distance. The word carried weight. No distance. I remember the light in the hallway. A detail. Simple. Ordinary. But it felt wrong. Not because of what it was. Because of what it meant. She saw me, he said again, softer. Or she knew something was there. That distinction mattered to him. Whether she saw him or sensed him. Either way, control had already shifted. I didn't plan to speak. He shook his head slightly. As soon as she turned, everything I had rehearsed, it didn't matter anymore. That was the second collapse. The structure of preparation breaking under presence. I thought she would freeze. A belief. A miscalculation. But she moved. The word was simple. But in his memory, it wasn't. It was fast. Faster than expected. Faster than allowed in the structure he had built in his mind. I didn't want noise. He said it plainly. As if noise was the true variable. Not consequence. Not harm. Just noise. I remember that clearly. A rare moment of clarity. I didn't want anyone else to hear. The detectives exchanged a glance, but said nothing. Because now the narrative had shifted. From abstraction to mechanics. I tried to stop it from becoming loud. He leaned forward slightly. Not emotional. Focused. Everything after that was about control again. Control returning in the only form still available to him. Not prevention. Containment. She hit the wall. A flat statement. No embellishment. No detail beyond what he chose to give. And then it stopped being something I could manage. That sentence carried more weight than anything before it, because it marked the failure of his system. I didn't think about what it meant. A correction. Immediate. Defensive, but not against them. Against memory. I only thought about what would happen next. Consequences. Exposure. Discovery. That was the only thing I was trying to avoid. The focus narrowed again. Not morality. Not outcome. Detection. I went back inside. That detail mattered. Not leaving. Continuing presence. That's where I made the mistake. He stopped. Longer this time. Not searching for words. Choosing them. I should have left. A simple truth. Delivered without emotion. But I didn't. Because leaving would mean acknowledgement. And acknowledgement meant loss of control. I stayed. The room felt smaller after that. Not physically, but in weight. Everything compressing around that decision. I thought I could fix it. The phrasing was important. Not undo. Not reverse. Fix. Like something broken. Mechanical. Manageable. But I couldn't. The first admission of limitation. Real limitation. Not strategic. I didn't know what to do with it. He looked up briefly. Then away again. That part one don't remember clearly. But the detectives knew what that meant. Memory doesn't disappear evenly. It fractures where the mind refuses continuity. I moved things. Another confirmation. The box. The order. the placement. It felt necessary. That word again. Necessary. Not emotional. Functional. I wanted it to look normal. The attempt at restoration. Control reasserting itself over chaos. That's what I was good at. A statement that almost sounded like identity. Not confession. Self-definition. Making things look like they belong. Silence stretched. Then one of the detectives spoke for the first time in a long while. Did she survive? The question wasn't harsh, but it was final. He didn't answer immediately. That pause wasn't avoidance. It was compression, like something inside him tightening. I don't know how to answer that. Not refusal. Not denial. Uncertainty framed as limitation. I left before I knew. That sentence landed differently, because it broke the assumption of narrative completeness. You left her there, the detective said carefully. He nodded once. Yes. No resistance. No justification. Just confirmation. The room held that for a moment. Heavy. Undeniable. Then he continued without being asked. I didn't think she would disappear like that. That was the first deviation from his earlier control-based framing. I thought it would be found. A belief. Incorrect, but sincere in its structure. I didn't understand what it would become. Cold case. Years. Silence. Erasure. That wasn't part of it. He said it plainly, as if the outcome had exceeded expected variables. The detectives didn't respond, because this was no longer about parsing truth. It was about containment of truth. I kept thinking about it after. He spoke slower now, less structured. I check sometimes. The admission shifted the air, not physically, but perceptibly. I would pass by buildings like it, not returning, passing, distance maintained. But I never went back inside. That mattered to him. A boundary he did not cross again. Not because I didn't want to, a correction, but because I knew I couldn't control what was inside anymore. The implication wasn't just psychological. It was practical. He had lost ownership of the space, of the illusion, of the system he had built over years. And then it became quiet again. Not peace. Not relief. Just absence. But I still noticed things. He looked down at his hands again, as I always did. Observation continued. Pattern recognition never stopped. I stopped going into places. That statement carried change. Reduction. Retreat. I thought it would end there. A belief in closure. But closure didn't come. It didn't. Because patterns don't disappear with singular events. They evolve. I started seeing similarities in other places. His voice lowered slightly. Not the same but close. The detectives remained still. Doors left slightly open. Things moved. Spaces that didn't feel right. He exhaled. I knew what it felt like. That sentence was different, because it suggested recognition extending beyond his own actions. Or, at least, his interpretation of them. And I stayed away. Another boundary. Self-imposed. Until I didn't have to think about it anymore. Time passing. Not resolution. Diminishing focus. He went quiet again. Longer this time. Then finally, I thought it was over. That phrase echoed differently now. Because nothing about the case had been over. Not for Evelyn. Not for anyone connected to it. But it wasn't. The detective leaned forward slightly. Why come forward now? The question that had been waiting. The one that always arrives at the end. He didn't answer immediately. Not because he was avoiding it. Because he was weighing something else. Then, because I remember everything now. Not confession. Not pressure. Memory. Fully returned. And it doesn't leave me anymore. That was the shift. The breaking point. Not of truth, but of containment. Every night, he said, quieter now. It's there.
No embellishment. No metaphor.
Just presence. I can't separate it. Silence filled the room. For the first time, it wasn't investigative. It was human. And fragile. I don't know what you want from me, he added finally. The detectives didn't answer immediately. Because what they wanted wasn't simple. It never had been. One of them finally spoke. The truth. He nodded slowly, as if that word had been inevitable. Then he said something that closed everything around him. I've been carrying it since 1987. Not as explanation, as duration. And in that moment, the case stopped being about what happened in that apartment. It became about everything that happened after. The silence, the avoidance, the years where nothing was said, but everything remained active beneath it. And now, after all that time, it was no longer contained. It was spoken.
And once spoken,
It could never be unspoken again. After the confession, the room didn't immediately move forward. It stalled. Not in confusion, but in weight. The kind of weight that sits on everything at once. Words, air, thought, even time itself. What had just been spoken didn't behave like information. It behaved like residue. Something that clings. Something that doesn't leave when the speaker stops talking. The detectives didn't interrupt him again.
they didn't need to.
The structure of control that had held the room together had already shifted. What remained now was not interrogation, but containment. He sat back in the chair, still composed, but quieter in a way that wasn't calm. It was depletion, not physical exhaustion. Psychological release. 34 years compressed into language, then released in fragments too sharp to remain clean. And yet, even after everything he had said, something remained unfinished. Not for them. For him. Because confessions rarely end where the facts end. They end where memory stops resisting. He stared at the table for a long time before speaking again. I didn't tell you everything. The sentence wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. Like correcting a record. One of the detectives shifted slightly. Not in reaction. In attention. But still, no one interrupted. He continued. There are parts one don't place clearly. Not uncertainty. Fragmentation. Not because I don't remember. A pause. But because they don't stay in order. That distinction mattered. Memory, in his case, wasn't missing. It was unstructured. I remember moments, he said. Not sequence. He lifted his hand slightly, then lowered it again.
Light. Sound.
Movement. Pieces. Not story. And then everything else fills in after. The detective in front of him finally spoke carefully. Fills in how? He hesitated. For the first time in the entire confession, not as control but as vulnerability. By repetition. That word again. Repetition. The same pattern that had defined everything leading up to 1987. I go back through it, he said. Not on purpose. He corrected himself immediately. Not like choosing to. A slight shake of the head. It happens. The implication was subtle, but heavy. Not memory recall. Memory intrusion. The past not being accessed, but returning. I see the apartment again. His voice lowered slightly. Not as it was. As it feels. That distinction mattered. Because it wasn't reconstruction. It was re-experience. Sometimes it's clear. A pause. Sometimes it's not. He exhaled slowly. And sometimes it's wrong. The detectives exchanged a glance again, but said nothing. Because now the confession had shifted away from external events. Into internal consequences. What do you mean, wrong? One asked. He didn't answer immediately. Not because he didn't understand. Because he was searching for precision. I remember things happening in different orders, he said finally. Or happening more than once. A subtle tension entered the room. Not fear, but recognition of instability. That's not possible, the detective said gently. He nodded. I know, but knowing didn't remove experience. And yet it still happens. Silence again.
Different now.
Not investigative. Observational. He leaned forward slightly.
Not toward them.
Toward the memory itself. I stopped trying to correct it. That admission mattered more than the others. Because it revealed surrender, not to authority, but to recollection. At some point, he said, you stop separating what happened from what returns. He looked up. Not directly at the detectives, but near them. As long as it keeps coming back the same way. A pause. It feels real enough. That sentence lingered, because it blurred the boundary between fact and perception in a way neither side could ignore. One of the detectives finally asked the question that had been forming since the beginning of the session.
Why now?
Why speak after all this time? He didn't respond immediately, but when he did, it wasn't what they expected. Because I don't think it belongs only to me anymore. That shifted the tone again. Ownership, responsibility, transfer. What does that mean? The detective asked. He looked down, then back up. I see it in places I shouldn't. A pause. Not people. Another correction. Patterns. That word again. It doesn't stay with her anymore. The detective stayed still. And it doesn't stay with me either. A silence followed that wasn't comfortable. It wasn't even tense. It was unclear. He continued. I thought it would end with time. A simple belief. One that had shaped decades. But it didn't reduce. That was important. Not escalation. Persistence. It changed form. The phrase landed differently, because it suggested something that wasn't fixed in one moment. Something that could extend beyond it. What do you mean, changed form? The detective asked. He hesitated, then answered carefully. It's not just the apartment. A pause. It's how I notice spaces now. That shifted everything. From past to present. I walk into places, and I know where things are wrong. He tapped lightly on the table. Doors that don't sit right. Windows that don't align. Rooms that feel offset. Not supernatural. Not abstract. Pattern recognition extended too far. And when I see it, he said, it doesn't leave. The implication wasn't confession anymore. It was condition. The detective leaned forward slightly. Are you saying you still believe?
No.
He cut in, not sharply, but firmly. I'm saying I still see. That difference mattered. Belief versus perception. The room absorbed that.
Carefully.
What happened after 1987 didn't stop anything, he continued. It just changed what I notice. That statement reframed the entire confession, because it suggested continuity, not closure. He exhaled again, longer this time, and I don't know which part is mine anymore. That was the closest thing to instability he had shown. Not confusion, dislocation. Identity and memory no longer aligned cleanly. I used to think I controlled it, he said. A faint, almost imperceptible shake of the head. But control doesn't last like that. Silence stretched. Then one of the detectives asked quietly, do you regret it? The question didn't land immediately. He didn't respond right away. When he did, it wasn't yes or no. It was something else. I don't know how to separate regret from memory. A pause. I remember everything. He looked down again. But I don't experience it the same way every time. That sentence was difficult to place. Because it didn't resolve anything. It expanded it. You're saying it changes? The detective asked. He nodded. Sometimes it feels like I was there watching. Another pause. Sometimes like I was inside it. The implication hung, without resolution. The detectives didn't push. Because pushing would collapse what remained. And what remained was the only structured account they had ever received. Finally, he spoke again. I didn't come here because I wanted to explain it. A correction. I came because it doesn't stay contained anymore. That word again. Contained. The core of everything. The more I hold it, he said, the more it returns differently. He looked up one last time. Not pleading. Not defensive. Just present. And I don't know what it becomes if I don't say it out loud. That was the final pivot. Because now the confession wasn't about the past. It was about the ongoing condition of carrying it. The detectives exchanged no words. They didn't need to. The case had shifted into something no longer purely investigative. It had become psychological, temporal, unstable in the way memory itself becomes unstable when it is held too long without release. He leaned back again. Not finished, but emptied. And for the first time, since the session began, the silence didn't feel like absence. It felt like continuation. as if everything he had said so far was only the surface layer of something still unfolding beneath it, something that hadn't finished revealing itself yet, and something that might never fully stop. Because once a story like this is spoken after decades of silence, it doesn't end at the final word. It continues inside the people who heard it, whether they want it to or not. The interview room was no longer functioning like a room. It had become a boundary between what was known and what could still shift, between testimony and interpretation, between a past that had been sealed for decades and a present that could no longer contain it cleanly. No one called it a breakthrough yet, because breakthroughs imply clarity. And this was not clear. It was layered, unstable, still moving, even after the words had stopped. He sat quietly now, not withdrawn, not resisting, just no longer extending the narrative, as if something inside him had reached its limit of articulation. The detectives didn't speak immediately either. They had everything they came for in fragments, but fragments alone don't behave like closure. They behave like pressure points, places where the case can be touched, but not resolved. Finally, one of them broke the silence. Tell us what happened after. A simple instruction. Not about the night anymore. About the aftermath. That question changed the air, because everything so far had been structured around the event. Now they were asking about what survived it. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was lower, not weaker, reduced. After I left. A pause. That part is always the same. The detectives waited. I left the building. He nodded slightly, as if confirming something to himself. And then it was quiet. That word again. Quiet. Not external. Internal. I remember walking, he said. Not running. He emphasized that, as if speed would imply panic. And I remember thinking I had done what I needed to do. That phrasing mattered. Not ended. Not fixed.
Done.
I didn't look back. A small pause. Not because I was afraid. Another correction. But because looking back would make it real in a different way. That distinction hung in the room. Reality as perception. Reality as confirmation. Two different things. He continued. The next days were normal. That word felt out of place. Normal. It was still the same city. A faint movement of his hand. Same streets. Same noise. He looked down again. But nothing matched inside it. That was the fracture point. Not external consequence. Internal dissonance. I thought it would fade.
He didn't say it.
He didn't define what it was. Just the assumption of fading. But it didn't. A pause. Not immediately. The detectives remained silent. He leaned slightly forward again, as if the next part required proximity to be said. At first, it was small things. His tone remained controlled. Sounds that reminded me of that night. A pause. Or spaces that felt the same. He struggled slightly with the word. Not emotionally. Structurally. But not the same exactly. He corrected himself again. Similar. That word mattered. Because similarity is what binds memory to recurrence. I would pass buildings and feel it again. He tapped lightly on the table. Not the event. A pause. But the structure around it. That was important. Not trauma. Pattern recognition. The way space felt before something changes inside it. The detectives didn't interrupt. Because this was no longer confession in the traditional sense. It was mapping. Of perception. Of memory architecture. And then I stopped trying to separate it. That statement carried weight. Because separation had been his only method of control. If you stop separating, the detective said carefully, what happens? He hesitated. Longer than before. Then answered. Everything becomes part of the same thing. A pause. That's when it stopped having edges. Edges. Boundaries. Distinctions. All dissolving. He leaned back slightly. I didn't talk about it to anyone. That was expected. And I didn't think I would. A correction. Not for decades. That was the first time he referenced duration without abstraction. 34 years compressed into one sentence. But it stayed active. The detective frowned slightly. Active. He nodded. Yes. No elaboration immediately. Then, not as memory. A pause. But as presence. The room tightened again. Not physically, but conceptually. Presence. He continued. It returns when I'm not thinking about it. That was the most unsettling part. Not recall. Intrusion. And when it does, he said, it doesn't feel like past. A pause. It feels like repetition. That word again. Repetition. The cycle that defined everything in the case. The detective spoke carefully. You're describing flashbacks. He shook his head slightly.
No.
A correction. Flashbacks are isolated. A pause. This isn't isolated. That distinction mattered deeply to him. It connects. He tapped the table once. Different moments. Different times. A pause. Same structure. The detectives exchanged a glance. Because now the confession was no longer anchored in one event. It was expanding. And what does that mean to you? The detective asked. He looked up. For a moment, something shifted in his expression. Not clarity. Not confusion. Recognition of inability to define. I don't know anymore. That was the first true admission of limitation. I used to think it was about what happened. A pause. But now I think it's about what keeps happening inside it. That sentence didn't resolve. It destabilized. The detective leaned forward slightly. You mean in your memory? He hesitated. Then, in experience. The distinction again. Memory versus experience. He continued. I can't always tell when I'm remembering it or when I'm inside it. Silence followed that. He didn't elaborate further. Because there was nothing more structured to add. And that's why you came forward, the detective said slowly. He nodded. Yes. A pause. Because it doesn't stay in one place anymore. That was the key. Containment failure. Not in evidence. In mind. I thought speaking would separate it again. A faint exhale. But it doesn't work that way. The detectives didn't respond. Because there was no procedural answer to that statement. Only acknowledgement. He leaned back again. Now it's here as well. He gestured slightly to the room. Not accusatory. Observational. Not just there. Meaning 1987. But here.
Meaning now.
That was the implication none of them wanted to fully articulate. That confession does not remain contained to the speaker. It spreads. Not physically. But cognitively. Into those who hear it. Into those who reconstruct it. Into those who must carry it forward as record. One of the detectives finally spoke. What happens next? The question wasn't about procedure. It was about him. He looked at them for a long moment. Then answered quietly. I don't know. A pause. But I don't think it stops. That sentence hung differently. Not as prediction. As recognition. The second detective finally spoke. You understand what you're admitting? He nodded. Yes. No hesitation. No resistance. And you're still saying it? Another nod. Yes. A long silence followed. Then he added something unexpected. I think it already happened. The room tightened. What did? The first detective asked. He looked down again. The stopping. That sentence didn't clarify anything. It inverted expectation. Because instead of ending, it suggested continuation. In another form. He continued. It never stayed in one time. A pause. Not for me. The implication wasn't fully formed. But it didn't need to be. Because what they were hearing now wasn't just confession. It was dissolution. Of boundaries. Of time. Of narrative containment. The detective sat still. No one spoke. Because anything added would fracture what remained. He exhaled slowly. Then said, almost softly, I think I've been telling it the same way for years. A pause. But it never stays the same when I finish. That was the final line that changed the tone of everything. Because it meant even now, even in confession, the story wasn't fixed. It was still shifting. Still unfolding. Still rearranging itself inside him. and outside him, and in the space between them. And for the first time since this began, no one in the room was certain where the past ended, or whether it ever truly had. The final silence wasn't an ending. It was exposure. Not of facts already known, but of everything that had been held in place by the assumption that a confession creates closure. In reality, it does the opposite. It removes the last barrier between story and listener, between memory and interpretation, between something that once belonged only to one mind and something now shared, irreversibly. He was still sitting there, but he no longer felt like the center of the room. He felt like something that had already been displaced, not physically, conceptually, as if the act of speaking had shifted him out of the present tense and left behind only a trace of him still capable of finishing sentences. No one moved to continue questioning him immediately, because there was nothing procedural left that didn't feel secondary. Everything had already been said, or, at least, everything that could be shaped into language. The detectives had expected resolution. What they had instead was a structure that refused to close. One of them finally broke the silence, not with a question about guilt, not about detail, but about something more fragile. What do you want from this now? It was not a legal question. It was human. He blinked slowly, once, then again, as if the question itself required translation. I don't want anything, he said. A pause. Then he corrected himself. That's not true. The correction mattered more than the first answer. I want to stop changing when I remember it. That sentence settled heavily, not because it clarified, but because it revealed instability as ongoing condition. The detective leaned forward slightly. Changing how? He hesitated, not in confusion, in recognition that whatever came next could not be made more precise without losing its shape entirely. Details move, he said finally. Not all at once. Just enough. A pause. Sometimes I see the same moment, but it doesn't sit in the same place. He looked down at his hands, as if it's being rearranged. The room remained still. And I can't tell anymore what came first. That admission didn't sound like uncertainty. It sounded like erosion. The second detective spoke quietly. You've described this before. He nodded. Yes. A pause. But it doesn't stay consistent. That was the final fracture point. Consistency had been the last remaining expectation of truth. And now even that was gone. He continued, quieter now. I used to think speaking would fix it. A faint exhale. But every time I speak, it shifts again. The detectives exchanged a glance. Not of disbelief. Of recognition that the phenomenon they were dealing with had moved beyond conventional framing. This was no longer only about a past event. It was about the instability of recollection itself. The first detective asked slowly, Do you understand what you're implying? He nodded. Yes. No hesitation. That it's not fixed. A pause. That it never was. The answer wasn't philosophical. It was procedural in his mind, as if describing a system failure rather than an ethical collapse. The room absorbed that without interruption. Then, unexpectedly, he added something softer. I don't think I've been telling it in order. The statement was simple, but it unraveled everything previously constructed. Not because order guarantees truth, but because without order, certainty collapses into repetition. The detective frowned slightly. Then what have you been telling us? He looked up slowly. Versions. A pause. The same one, but not the same. That distinction carried weight that was difficult to articulate. And you believe all of them? The detective asked. He paused. Longer than before. Then, I experience all of them. That was the key. Experience. Not belief. Not memory. Experience as something recurring rather than recalled. The second detective leaned back slightly. You understand why that matters?
He nodded again.
Yes. But he didn't elaborate. Because in his mind, the implication was already complete. The difference between remembering and reliving had dissolved long ago. There was a silence that followed, different from earlier silences. This one didn't hold tension. It held exhaustion. Not physical exhaustion, but narrative exhaustion. As if every available explanation had already been used, and none had fully contained what they were describing. Finally, the first detective spoke again. "We're going to document everything you've said." A standard statement. But it landed differently now. Because documentation implies stability. Fixing something in place. And nothing in this room felt fixed anymore. He nodded. Slowly. "As long as it doesn't change when you write it." It wasn't a challenge. It was observation. The detective didn't respond. Because there was no procedural answer to that either. The interview was nearing its end, but not in a formal sense. More like a natural collapse of continuation. He had nothing more structure to offer. And they had nothing more structure to ask. Still, one question remained. The one that had followed this case from the beginning, even before they knew how to phrase it properly. The second detective asked it quietly. "What happened to Evelyn Carter?" The room changed again. Not sharply, but completely. He didn't respond immediately. For the first time, his expression shifted away from structure. Not toward emotion exactly, but toward distance. "I've answered that," he said. A pause. But it never stays the same answer. That sentence hung longer than any before it, because it implied instability, not just in memory, but in conclusion. The detective pressed gently. "What is the answer now?"
He looked at them.
Not directly at one, at the space between them, and spoke carefully. "Now it feels like it's still happening." That answer did not fit into any expected category. Not denial, not confession, not evasion, continuation. The first detective narrowed his eyes slightly. "Still happening where?" He didn't answer immediately. Then, "Not where." A pause. "When?" That correction shifted the entire axis of the room, because it removed geography from the equation, and replaced it with time, or the collapse of it. The detective said nothing. There was nothing to say, because anything said now would assume structure, and structure was no longer reliable in what they had just heard. He exhaled slowly. "I don't know if I ever left it," he said finally. A pause. "Or if it ever left me." That was the final statement. Not dramatic, not conclusive, but dissolving. The detectives remained seated. He remained seated. Nothing signaled conclusion, but nothing needed to. Because what had been established over the last hours was not a solved case. It was a loop of narrative that refused to stabilize into a single version. A man who had lived inside memory so long that memory no longer distinguished itself from experience. And a truth about 1987 that now existed in multiple states at once. Event, recollection, repetition, and instability. The case file would later describe it in procedural language. Confession obtained. Details inconsistent. Subject exhibits fragmented temporal recall. But that would not capture what had actually happened in that room. Because what they had witnessed was not just a confession. It was the collapse of a boundary that had held for 34 years. And what remained after that collapse was not clarity. It was echo. Still repeating. Still rearranging. Still unresolved. Even as the room finally went quiet.